So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for joining our second Monash Sustainable Development Institute Research Seminar for 2022. So my name's Cameron Allen. I'm a research fellow at MSDI, where I'm working with Shirin Malikpour on the next UN Global Sustainable Development Report. I'd like to start the session by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land the Monash campuses are located in Melbourne. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Jagera people on whose land I'm located in Brisbane, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So as you know, the MSDI Research Seminar Series aims to foster conversations and dialogues on the grand sustainable development challenges of our time. And climate change is certainly one of those. We've seen a series of unprecedented and devastating extreme events in recent years, and here in Brisbane, where I am, we're still cleaning up the mess from the recent rain bomb that hit the East Coast. And it made me think back to when I finished my undergrad about 20 years ago. My first job was developing the New South Wales climate change adaptation strategy. And at that time, climate change impacts were, largely perceived as something down the track in the future that we needed to plan for. That situation's clearly changed. Climate change is here and has already caused widespread impacts and damage. And climate change risks are becoming increasingly complex and difficult to address, with effects that are compounding and cascading across different sectors and regions. So with the constant disruption now seemingly the new normal, there's an urgent need to build resilience in all sectors, including in the academic and research sector. So for today's session, I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Lauren Rickards from the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies at RMIT University. Lauren is the co-lead of the Climate Change Transformation Research Program in the Centre of Urban Research and director of the Cross-University Urban Futures Enabling Capability Platform. Lauren is also a lead author of the Australasian chapter in the recent IPCC report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. And today, Lauren will be presenting on climate change risks to universities, exploring why the academic sector is one of the slowest when it comes to climate change adaptation and what a proactive academic sector might look like. Just so you know, we are recording the session today. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end of the session, so feel free to put them in the chat or to raise your hand after the presentation. So thank you again to Lauren. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Cameron. And many thanks to Rob too, I can see online, for inviting me here today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land here in the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung country of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and pay my respect and gratitude to their elders, past, present and emerging. As we know, climate change adaptation is increasingly timely and pertinent, and we're pleased to know that at the moment I'm actually presenting from a room that's still hail damaged from a hailstorm back in September, and hence part of my office, normal office format is not working. So anyway, we're all struggling with this. It's a lived reality. And one of the things that this means is that those of us in universities more than ever need to really band together and start thinking about this. I've been lucky to be working in just the recent past and in present with a range of really smart people on these themes, and today is a bit of an amalgam of ideas discussed in our new Climate Resilience Living Lab, Todd Denham, Ingrid Baker, Ollie Moraes, as well as my good colleague Wendy Steele, the Centre for Urban Research, including work on universities' SDGs, Adriana Keating, who's here, thanks Adriana, looking at sort of systemic approaches to adaptation, and Blanche Bailey, who's also here, which is fantastic, and Todd's here too, I should have said. So really great to have some of the sort of co-contributors to this here today. So this is a little bit of amalgam. My head is a little bit sort of spinning at the moment. I've been doing a wide range of things, particularly around with the recent IPCC report. So you'll get a little bit of a dose of that. But I'm sort of pulling together a range of different sort of projects and things here. And forgive me if I don't quite achieve the rather ambitious abstract that I put together, which of course we always look back on and think, what was I thinking? So yes, I won't exactly have all the answers, but anyway, at least I'll help lay out some of the challenges. Okay, so what is the adaptation challenge that we're facing? Well, as many people here would know, climate change risks and impacts are extremely complex. And you'll be pleased to know that the IPCC, including in its recently released sixth assessment report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, really underlines this complexity, moving beyond the standard approach, focusing on climatic hazards and exposures to them, to understanding also the key role of existing vulnerabilities, so everything else in the world, the situation that hazards and impacts hazards collide with to create impacts, and of course the adaptations that actually help to actually reduce those. So when you think about that, you sort of get this kind of mathematical sort of type approach that the impacts are like the sum sort of total of all that. What we're increasingly understanding too are the feedbacks. And so this is the way in which those impacts are exacerbating some of the climatic hazards and their interactions. And so think, for example, of the ways in which bushfire actually makes the effects of subsequent floods far worse, as we've seen up in the north where Cameron is, as well as increasing exposures at all sorts of scales, including, of course, that of the house, and exacerbating vulnerabilities. So if we think of the adaptation challenge as one of trying to outpace the proliferation of risks, so this is a little bit like running up the wrong way up an escalator, but that escalator is accelerating. So if we think of that, then what we can understand is that adaptation is about outpacing that. And it also points to some of the ways in which adaptation can work. It can try to reduce climatic risks, it can try to reduce exposures, it can try to reduce vulnerability. So it gives you a sense, just for those of here who aren't kind of working specifically in this field, of the range of things adaptation can involve. The other thing to emphasize is that this is not just in terms of sort of physical locations. We often sort of think of this in a fairly sort of contained type place-based way. The place-based aspect is absolutely crucial, but we also need to think across some of the different scales, the different shared enabling systems. And so this image here from the University of Tasmania following some flooding in the 2017 floods gives you an indication that even our ability to connect here today through the magic of Zoom, through the magic of ICT, information communication technology systems, the magic of electricity, means that we're all here connecting across states, across places to talk about this. And this is something we can't just take for granted, this ability to connect like we are here today. What that means is that climate change adaptation, as I indicated, is partly about climate risk management, but it's more and more about vulnerability reduction, and all of that needs to be multiplied by resilience thinking. One of the kind of really interesting developments in the Melbourne area around this, which points to this sort of holistic systemic type approach, is this idea of Regen Melbourne, of the idea of actually working across all of these different approaches so that we can actually put ourselves in a better position regardless of what the climate's throwing at us. Okay, so as I said, one of the things that's been really foremost in my mind over the last few weeks, not to mention 4 years, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. I was one of the leads of the chapter on Australasia, which is the odd term used for Australia and New Zealand. And it identifies a number of what's called key regional risks. All of these require long seminars in and of themselves. So I want to focus in on a couple, the top two in the box there, because they're, I think, reflective of the very contemporary situation that we're in right now. The first of these is the cross-sectoral and system-wide risks. So very much influenced by the sorts of complex flow-on effects we saw from the bushfires in 2019, 2020. It's very apparent that impacts are not just sort of occurring and staying in place, but are cascading and compounding across sectors, across socioeconomic and natural systems. So this can look like infrastructural breakdowns, where even if you're located in Melbourne, for example, you might oddly find yourself without electricity. You might find yourself without communications. And of course, the compounding too, and think here particularly of the compounding and degradation on some of our natural systems as well. So this is one of the absolutely key messages of the chapter, is the need to address these. Just to kind of divert just quickly, what we mean by cascading are those that propagate through different connections, different relationships, whether that's an infrastructural one or whether it's an essential service dependency, a supply chain dependency, as well as higher order systems like economies and social relations. The compounding is that in place at various scales, absolute intersection of all of these things, and the ways in which that can create enormous issues with responding to the latest in a series of impacts. And the aggregate is when it sort of adds up, and that is particularly starting to become evident at scales such as the national economy. So the other key risk here is what we've called the inability of institutions and governance systems to manage climate risks. This is focused particularly on governments, and that inability that we're already starting to see, particularly in the Australian rather than the New Zealand situation, of adaptation policies and actions lagging behind. But I think it's also safe to say that academic institutions and systems are also lagging behind. And so there's a risk that they actually get caught in that need to outpace adaptation. So the basic message is, if we don't start to adapt our academic institutions and systems quickly, they can start to slip backwards. And that, of course, has flow-on effects for all those who rely upon them. So the overall message out of the IPCC report, just to kind of summarise that, is that we're now seeing these cascading, compounding impacts and risks. These are placing greater pressure on our ability to respond. And so while we've started the work of adaptation, the progress is uneven and insufficient given the risks that we face. So it's a pretty sobering message. All right, so what about universities? So when we think about universities, we tend to sort of have a fairly narrow and one-dimensional type approach to them. But what we need to do is start thinking across all of their different aspects. So of course, there's the people aspect, staff such as ourselves, students such as ourselves, and all those that we work with. There's all of the other, stakeholders, whether it's research partners or whether it's neighbouring organisations, etc. And all of the ways in which their well-being, their desire to be part of the university, and their ability to perform their particular role within the university is being impacted. And that in and of itself is just a massive area that we need to unpack. Then, of course, there's all the sort of physical spaces, that campus approach and the assets, and there's increasing focus on trying to sort of think of those in terms of broader landscapes and waterscapes. There's also the interdependent infrastructural systems. So, very much taking that approach of understanding that universities are pretty useless in blackouts. We're pretty useless if those wider electricity systems don't work. And we have to remember too that when we talk about those physical spaces and assets, as I think probably the geographical footprint of today's webinar would indicate, they are now highly decentralised and distributed through people's homes as well, including my own here today. And we need to think about all the sort of interactions between those infrastructural systems, which is the sort of work that I've been doing with Adriana. There's also the essential services and supply chains. Just think, for example, of how disruptive some of the supply chain disruptions caused by COVID, as well as a drought in Taiwan, have been in the computer parts and electricity grid parts supply chain. So we're talking here about semiconductors and things. Who knew we were so reliant on semiconductor supply chains? And the multi-scale networks and processes, including publishers, including that hugely laborious voluntary labour system known as peer review. Just think about how universities would grind to a halt if that was to stop, as we've seen indications of with COVID, as well as the governance, legal, and of course funding systems as well. And we've also had some indications here in Australia of the far-reaching effects of things such as delays in ARC processes and systems. So if we think across these sorts of things, then you start to have a sense of where we might look for impacts. So this is all just preliminary work that I'm hoping to really ramp up over the next few months. But if you start thinking about even just what's sort of evident in recent times and in the media, you start to see the sorts of impacts, and I'll unpack this a little bit more, drawing on work I've been doing with Blanche in a moment. But there's the direct impacts on staff and students. There's of course the campus and equipment damage side of things. So just 2 flood examples. So the 2017 floods saw Southern Cross University using some of its facilities for local businesses. It's now a major evacuation centre for thousands of people, and they expect that it will be offline for university business for months and months. And likewise, many other universities have been terribly impacted by the current floods. There's all the disruption to teaching and flow-on effects, and I'm sure we all have examples of that in our own lives. There's insurance costs, and I know that the University of Queensland, which is currently incredibly badly affected by the current floods, also had a shock in terms of insurance changes after the 2011 floods. There's public criticism, and so one of the things that's come out with the current floods, for example, is criticism of decisions over recent times to reduce flood research, for example, and disrupt and delayed research, which is a particular focus that I've been looking at. So giving you some examples of some of the Australian research impacts, and drawing on a paper I've done with a colleague in UQ called James Watson, you can see that part of it is about the sort of these sort of physical effects, including on things like the computer equipment, libraries and glass houses. But part of it too is just on the ways in which the non-university infrastructure that we rely on, notably our homes and our communities, is also impacted, and what that means for our ability to perform our role as staff members. And in all these different ways, climate change is starting to sort of squeeze and pressure our ability to keep doing the kind of treadmill, if you like, of research. Now, I love research, I don't mean to be dismissive of it, but there is a sense of its continuous momentum, which is very, very hard to continue and to maintain in the face of accelerating climate change. So some of the damage, and this is one from the recent, the ongoing floods in UQ, is to the physical infrastructure, as I said, and so glass houses are being affected. And one of the feedbacks that's happening here is that in some cases, such as these 2 glass house examples, one at CSIRO and one at UQ, is that the research that's being affected is actually for adaptation. So you start to see some of the feedbacks that are at work here. So in these 2 cases, we're talking about agricultural research, particularly on crops, including drought-resistant varieties being wiped out by these floods, or in the case of CSIRO, by the hail. And so that sort of sense of even just in terms of climate change adaptation research being affected, you start to see some of the complexities of doing that in a climate changing world. Part of it too is about the importance of continual environmental monitoring. So I used to be involved deputy chair of the advisory group of the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network, which is really involved in a whole national network of ecological and ecosystem research infrastructure, including things like flux towers. It's really, really important for these, just like many other forms of scientific research, to have continuous data streams. But what we're finding, so in this case, in the 2019-2020 fires, is that they themselves get damaged. And then, of course, what's damaged is not just the infrastructure, but the data flows, the data streams. And so you then get gaps in the record precisely when you possibly are seeing the most interesting data. And so that's a huge, huge problem. I want to now jump into 2 case studies to try to sort of just test this out a little bit more, tease out some of the complexities here. So back in the Millennium Drought, so approximately 2006 to 2011, I did a large study which was sort of pieced together bit by bit with little bits of funding from here and there to do a longitudinal study of the effects of the drought on farm families and communities up in northwest Victoria around Birchip. It was all organised through the Birchip Cropping Group. And some of the effects of that were very evident in terms of the effects on agricultural production, but of course also more broadly the effects on families and their ability to actually make decisions, which is that sort of sense of paralysis that some of us are starting to feel as well. At the same time, we were so focused on drought and adaptation to drought and studying drought that we were somewhat paralysed by it too. So we were, as researchers, were caught off guard when the 2011 floods, 2010, 2011 floods came through, and suddenly the research project became not just a drought project, but actually a drought plus flood, which we called climate variability, climate change project. So we had to pivot in that research project to actually then encompass these new climatic conditions, these new weather conditions at the time, as well as flow-on effects like this incredible mouse plague that happened. What that also meant was that the ability to do the research at the same time as changing the direction and the content and the questions, the ability to do the research was also disrupted by the floods. And in particular, I trained up some local women in the area to help with the interviews, and some of them were flooded out, so they were unable to do it. And so then I drove up there, but of course I couldn't get around because the roads were damaged. And, you know, we were living the impacts that we were trying to document. And one way to sort of think about all of this was of the disruptions. And so the drought was experienced by both the farm families and by us as researchers as a kind of disruption to our normal regular sense of progress, our normal timelines. And that disruption in and of itself, the anxiety of not being able to progress was considerable for all of us at the same time. At the same time, there was that sense of kind of erosion and things not being able to sort of be sustained. And so, for example, as I said, the project itself was eked together with bits and small pieces of funding, and that's because it went on for far longer than it thought. We thought it was going to be a 12-month project, ended up being a 5-year project because the drought kept continuing and then the floods as well. So we had to keep finding more money all the time. And the dissolution, that sort of sense of losing purpose, losing identity, and that was particularly acute for the farmers and farm families involved. And so there's that sense of what at the time I called the sort of coping cascade, slipping backwards, and you can see here the resonance with the IPCC report on this sort of sense of adaptation having to outpace the proliferation of impacts. And so, as I was indicating, there's parallels all the way here between the effects on the farmers and the farm families, the farming communities, and on us as researchers, the need to pivot, the need to keep going while exhausted, really exhausted, and also this sort of blurred boundary that particularly happened between interviewer and interviewee. So I ended up interviewing the woman who was originally the interviewer about her experiences of the flood, for example. Okay, so I want to now turn, with big thanks to Blanche, who's here today, to a second example of how this is sort of starting to play out as well. So this is looking at the effects on the research project done during Black Summer and the effects of actually trying to do research around climate change while in the midst of it. And I will just do this in brief and note that Blanche would be happy to speak about this afterwards as well. So the impacts on the field, on the research content, the research results themselves, are very much about disruption. So this was looking at the studying kids in schools and their experiences of education, and it was disrupted by the fact that that was very, very much coloured by the smoke and the experiences of trying to actually find safe spaces, the difficulties teachers were having trying to keep kids calm, trying to stay calm themselves, and this idea of actually, you know, the dissolution of the world, that the classroom climate, as they often talk about in educational research, of course, became climatic in and of themselves, and this idea of teachers having to negotiate that. And the impacts on researchers included at the time things like effects on the Sydney University campus that also we experienced here in Melbourne, and this idea of actually our workplaces not being disconnected from or separate from, not being an ivory tower when it came to climate change, not a place we go to think about something at a distance, but something that's very much completely infused with the topic that we're studying. And so the impacts here, and Blanche could speak to this far more eloquently than I, but just the disruption of that needed sense of having to respond. And I've been experiencing this, I think Blanche has too, and many others here probably too, needing to respond, for example, to the current floods, to be responsive to the kind of impacts and events of the time, how depleting all of this is, which is just so evident to all of us. And then this sort of dissolution, like who's actually the participant, who are we actually studying? Are we actually studying ourselves? And really the kind of the kind of inevitable auto-ethnographic aspect that's inserted into research because of the absolute unavoidability of climate change. Okay, so that was just to kind of give you a sense of some of the complexity of what we're talking about here. So if we zoom back out to universities and climate change adaptation at the moment, I want to now just sort of touch on where we think universities are. And the short story is they're actually lagging behind many other sectors. So we're really good at doing research and education around adaptation, helping others, doing advice and consultancies. And many people in this webinar have been leading in this regard, doing incredibly important work. But as far as the universities themselves and the university sector as a whole adapting, there's not a huge amount of evidence. So if you compare it, for example, to, so this graph over here is a recent analysis of adaptation research. What you actually see is that almost has been going on despite an inability or a kind of unwillingness among universities to really seriously engage with adaptation. There is some work going on, disaster risk management type work, particularly stimulated by major events. So for example, in the US, there's quite a lot of work that's been stimulated by various hurricanes, but generally speaking, there's not a lot of adaptation talk in universities about universities. What you do see is some guidance notes that are coming out. So in the UK, there's focus, this is focus on business continuity. So this is coming out of a kind of risk management policy perspective, and there's a large risk management community, professional community across universities. Now, this document doesn't actually talk about climate, doesn't talk about adaptation, barely talks about even natural disasters. It's primarily focused on, you know, terror attacks, cyber attacks, these sorts of things. And interestingly, pandemics too. But what you also see, even within this focus, is that there's still a sense in which the idea of having to keep universities functioning is a little bit of a blind spot. So there's a lot of work in universities, and some of the roles I play at RMIT give me insight into kind of this rather, you know, arcane world of risk management in universities. There's a lot of focus on risk registers and keeping note of all the risks and demonstrating good governance and how these are being managed. And that's very much around the sort of prevention of risks. There's also stuff on acute emergency management, so particular processes with regard to particular hazards and incidences, like how to actually keep staff and students safe, for example, and increasingly stuff on business recovery, particularly in the wake of COVID and the kind of work going on about getting student numbers back up, getting income back up, etc. But what they're finding is that there's a little bit of a gap around what's called business continuity. And interestingly, I think this reflects a very telling top-down mindset, or what you might think of a kind of ivory tower syndrome, which is this sense, as this quote here says, that sometimes institutions themselves as customers, so that means as users of infrastructure, as users of essential services, are ill-equipped to cope with interruption. So you get a sense of what some of the barriers are here. Now, Todd and I, who's here, Todd, and other colleagues, Ingrid and Ollie, we've started to do a bit of analysis of what's publicly available about climate change adaptation in Australian universities. And generally speaking, most of our 42 universities don't refer to climate change adaptation, particularly in high-level whole of university, whole of institution strategies. A couple have some detailed adaptation strategies, and some include adaptation sort of to a greater or lesser degree in sustainability planning, and with a particular focus on campuses, but none of that sort of infrastructural networked aspect. And there's been some commitments made, but generally speaking, there's a real need to expand the reach of adaptation, very much in keeping with those broader observations in the IPCC report, and also to move from planning to implementation, which is another one of the key conclusions of the IPCC assessment of global adaptation, is that there's a lot of planning and not a lot of action, and that means we're slipping behind. At the same time, we can start to see where some of the issues are lying. So I've already referred a little bit to this ivory tower syndrome. Certainly it was evident when we looked at that idea of research and research infrastructure and researchers being vulnerable to climate change and disasters as opposed to actually being able to go out and research them. There's also that, as I said, an indication of that in analysis of lack of business continuity planning. At the same time, we're also starting to see, and I think we could all intuitively understand, that there's a big issue here with those non-climatic vulnerabilities. So that big basket of that big contribution to impacts that I tried to emphasize at the start, massively relevant for universities. Just think about all of the different ways in which we're struggling at the moment. I'm thinking particularly of colleagues over in the UK. You also see that the existing frameworks have a really strong path dependency. So what we're finding is that adaptation's being slotted in where, as I said there, it fits least badly. So it's slotting in as a sort of aspect of a sustainability plan, or it's slotting in as a line in a risk management register. What we're not seeing so much are coherent integrated adaptation plans. And so there's a huge need to really get on and do this in a much more systematic way. In terms of what adaptation is needed, as I indicated, we need a whole range of different approaches, from climate risk management through to vulnerability reduction, through to building resilience in all sorts of different ways. And there's a whole area of work sort of ripe for the application to universities in terms of resilience principles, for example. We need to look at all of the different aspects of universities, so not just campuses, not just staff safety or OH&S. We need to actually look at all of these different things that keep them functioning. Some of these things are intangible, but really are core to what actually makes universities universities and keeps them working. And as the IPCC report emphasises very, very strongly, there's a great need for what's called transformational adaptation, which is fast, wide, and very, very holistic, and also that which actively overcomes the barriers in the process of doing adaptation. So in conclusion, universities are highly and increasingly vulnerable to climate change, but at the same time, they're oddly invisible in and often silent about adaptation. We prefer to talk about it in presentations such as this, and get together and kind of think of it as a research topic or as a class education focus, and less as something we're doing in practice. A lot of the things that are called climate change adaptation, that are labelled as adaptation universities, tend to be focused on the unique aspects of universities. That's both their educational offerings, so the courses they have, for example, and there's a range of courses now on adaptation and also programs and degrees, and on research, but generally only in terms of the content, not the actual functioning and doing of those. And we need a far more systemic, grounded understanding of universities, including an appreciation of how they're just regular old organisations and have all of these sort of normal business functions, because let's face it, they are businesses these days, that they're highly networked, and so they're part of these emplaced systems of infrastructure and supply chains, and of course thinking through the ways in which they influence others' adaptation outcomes. So is the work we're doing contributing to lowering vulnerability, for example, amongst our stakeholders, or is in fact it's worsening it in some ways? We also now can see that adaptation in university means that we have to overcome some of the silos. So whether those silos are between the risk management and sustainability policy areas that I referred to, I haven't touched on it, but there's also a very clear gap between academic and professional staff shown up by this, partly because we do a whole lot of research on it, yet we're not acting on it. So what does that say about those connections? And certainly it's no secret that universities are very good at doing things without contacting or engaging the experts within their own staff bodies on that. Staff and students is a consistent one, universities and their local communities, and though we're overcoming it here today, between universities. And so what we need to do is also think about how to work in these different ways, and also to connect with the broader systems that we're part of, including things like research funding and research funding systems, and the experiences of COVID and the disruptions on funding, and what that means for all sorts of different staff, including vulnerable groups such as HDR students who have timelines, really tight timelines that are very vulnerable to disruption. What does that disruption to funding mean for them? At the same time, there's many promising levers, and I'm sure many of you have thought of many during this talk as well. So we have existing policy areas where we can work and use that as a seed to grow towards broader, more integrated adaptation approaches. At the same time, I haven't had a chance to go into it here, but there's a lot of focus in government and business on critical infrastructure resilience. So far, that doesn't talk about research infrastructure, but I actually had the opportunity to talk to our chief scientist and told her we have to get research infrastructure into those conversations. And so there's an opportunity there. There's a lot of place-based adaptation initiatives, and sometimes they do include university campuses, as well as, of course, the distributed decentralized campus that universities now work out of, aka our homes. Climate emergency declarations, there's experts in the room here about that, but they are a huge lever and opportunity, especially if adaptation is really recognised as an enabler of mitigation. Basically, as Blanche and I wrote about recently in the paper, mitigation is a lot of hard work, and that hard work requires that we adapt so that we're well set up and able to do that hard work. And so there's very much synergy there. SDGs, hugely important and relevant to this group here. The SDG commitments are not just relevant here in terms of SDG 13, but the fact that all of the other SDGs contribute to that vulnerability reduction, to that building of adaptive capacity, to that building of generic resilience that is needed to reduce impacts. So there's a huge opportunity to build adaptation to some of those conversations. And of course, we're part of, what's often called research and innovation ecosystems. There's usually nothing eco about the way they're used. And think about the ways in which we can actually build ourselves and our universities into some of the research we're doing through, for example, the idea of living labs that many of you would be familiar with. And just 2 more slides. One is just to say that when we think about university adaptation, it's an opportunity to think more broadly about adaptation, to find insights and some of the gaps. One of the sort of fairly kind of perhaps mundane seeming gaps, but I actually think is quite a crucial gap that this work has identified for me around adaptation is that universities' kind of blind spot around business continuity, I think is actually probably common across a lot of organisations. And at the same time, this whole business continuity kind of world is not talking about climate change or adaptation. So there's a big opportunity to go and talk about that with them. So this higher education business continuity network in the UK, for example, doesn't say anything or do anything on climate change or adaptation. So there's a ready kind of community there to engage with. And overall, analysing this means that we have to increasingly appreciate that we're inside the systems that are being affected. So all of us in those decision-making roles, as often talked about in the adaptation literature, all of us in those institutions and organisations that are at failure, that are at the risk of failing, as the IPCC report concludes, all of us need to see that the first thing we need to do to stop those institutions failing is to understand their vulnerability, understand our role within them, and think about all the feedbacks that reflects and also triggers as well. Okay, I'll leave it there, but thank you very much and look forward to talking with you.
Well, thanks very much, Lauren. That was a fantastic presentation, and thanks very much for joining us and sharing your insights from your research as well as your experience with the IPCC process. I'd like to open the floor to questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, perhaps if you can raise your hand and I'll just take from the list, or you could also place your questions in the chat. And Lauren, you also mentioned you had some colleagues here on the call. I mean, if we could invite them to make an intervention as well, that'd be very welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see Blanche and Todd and Adriana, and also other adaptation experts such as Bryony and Scott.
So we have one question here from Rob in the chat. Would you like me to read it out, or can you read that?
I can see that.
Okay.
What type of research questions? Yeah, that's a really good question, Rob. And I have to say that, like, you know, you can probably feel some of my personal angst around all this. Like, it is just quite difficult to get that intellectual separation to try to then formulate those research questions. I would say it's a challenge. I mean, I do think that there's two things. One is that I think this points to a really important need to reconceptualize both how we think of impacts and how we think of adaptation with regards to that. And I've sort of tried to point to sort of some of the kind of openings around that, sort of slightly more systemic ways of thinking about it. And in parallel, a real need to sort of conceptualize universities in a different sort of way. So, for example, in the with some of the Climate Resilience Living Lab colleagues, we're increasingly thinking of the boundary around universities as very porous. And I've indicated that today just a little bit in terms of the kind of infrastructural networked relationship of it, but it's also in terms of the flows of professionals. If you think that given the unfortunate sort of separation between academic and professional staff in most universities, the fact that adaptation is primarily in the kind of work plans of professional staff, even if it's not evident there yet, and you think about the sort of backgrounds and career pathways of those professionals, most of them are not university specialists. And so we're actually sort of run and adapted, if you like, or will be adapted by a lot of people who are working across different sectors, of which the university is just one organisation that they work in for a while and then move in. We're doing this really interesting analysis of the sort of professionalisation of adaptation and the way that's sort of playing out in universities. So I'm not really answering your question, but there's a lot of background conceptual work. The other side of it, I would say, is that there's a huge amount for some pretty basic empirical analysis too, you know, just to get some baseline understandings. Where are the impacts emerging? I've indicated just a few of those, but trying to get to grips with that. And also, where are the adaptation actions emerging, noting that some things are counted as adaptation, but probably don't have necessarily positive adaptation outcomes. Other things labelled as adaptation do have positive adaptation outcomes. So there's a kind of conceptual, challenge there as well. So that would be two areas, the conceptual and the empirical.
Thanks, Lauren. We have another question here from Darren.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Lauren, for your excellent presentation today. I appreciate it. I just wanted to link this into net zero, because we've obviously got the net zero initiative happening at Monash, which is a multi-year commitment by the university. Involves a lot of partnerships and research, education and translation activities that are ongoing, that I'm involved with colleagues and so on. I just wanted to get your sense of how you see the net zero side of this relating to, what you were talking about in terms of resilience and adaptation to climate change from university.
Yeah. Well, if I can just start by making the kind of high level statement that, sorry to keep banging on about this, but I've just been talking about it continuously for 2 weeks, but one of the conclusions of the IPCC report is that mitigation is the absolute foundational enabler of adaptation. So without mitigation, adaptation will fail. It's not going to be sufficient. So, there's the kind of reinforcement of the value of net zero initiatives. At the same time, adaptation is the enabler of mitigation, as I indicated too, because of the work involved in mitigation. So at that sense, there's like a complete synergy and overlap between them. In more practical terms, I think because universities are more engaged in mitigation questions, primarily through that sort of sustainability pillar, then it's the great opening for what we need to start discussing. And at the same time, if we started by just simply saying, how are all of our mitigation efforts, our net zero efforts, vulnerable to climate change? How are they being disrupted? How are they being impacted? It gives us a really nice case study of the broader effects and challenges facing universities as well. I mean, that's one of my major kind of gut-wrenching concerns, is that mitigation is going to be undermined by impacts themselves. So that's kind of, I guess, 3 different ways in which we can think about it. But, it's all positive. It's all very much reinforcing the value of the net zero work. I think we're way past the kind of old idea that they're somehow, in tension or competing.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks, Lauren. So the next I have Brioni.
Hey, Lauren, good to see you, and I love your work as always. I'm curious, just want to go back to your reflection on the role of universities and the need to shift away from silos and so on. And, in our Fire to Flourish program, we're trying to work in a different way where community knowledge is valued alongside academic knowledge and Indigenous knowledge, and working with policymakers and practitioners on that ground in the real transdisciplinary setting. And it is hard. It is so hard to do this kind of cross-boundary work. And the university systems and all the incentive structures and all the enabling support systems, they're not set up for this kind of work. And so I think if I look around at the history of universities and the kind of traditional model, it is so much more of that separate view. And I think Monash and RMIT are probably at the leading edge of this mode of work. But I'm curious, we have to go through an organisational transformation ourselves to be able to contribute to society in a way that's urgently needed. And I'm curious around your thoughts on the levers. How can we as organisations do the kind of transformation needed? What have you seen as seeds of really successful levers and so on?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for that question and observation, because you're absolutely spot on. And just on the research kind of side of things, I didn't sort of have time to go into it, but the effects on our research partners, and Adriana and I could tell you about how hard it has been, impossible in fact, to set up research with the SES. Because every time we go to meet with them, they're busy going off dealing with another disaster. So the effects on our research partners, and others you would know about kind of the slower moving effects as well. And also the challenges to, our ontologies, our epistemologies, our hierarchies of knowledge as well. And these are the kind of deeper impacts, possibly positive impacts on academia as well. So how do we actually then look at those organisational aspects? Well, it's not easy, of course. I have to say, like, I chair the RMIT University Research Committee, so we're actually really wrestling with these sorts of things, usually under the kind of more kind of mundane banner of interdisciplinarity, but it's sort of moving in the same direction. And it comes down to, very well-known but difficult things like incentive structures, so promotion frameworks. Can you, for example, give more loading in metrics to research that's co-authored with industry partners and community partners? It comes down to, finding the seeds that you can kind of help people to initially get over. So we're implementing a new university-wide HDR training program, which talks about working with research partners from the start. So they're just sort of, I guess, reinforcing what you're saying, is like, it's just like a whole range of difficult things. Having said that, I also think there's always that organizational culture question and the cultural change. So at RMIT, speaking bluntly, we've got two structures. We've got our college structure, which is along disciplinary lines, 3 colleges. And then we also have these, what are called, we're pleased to know, we now just call them platforms, but that are set up to foster cross-disciplinary thing. And they've basically operated separately, kind of, just kind of in their own little way. And that's partly because of resistance from the colleges who, see them as competing for resources and all that sort of stuff. But we've worked really hard to kind of, I guess, bring a lot of college stakeholders along. And so we are getting some cultural change. We're getting some changes in leadership. And so there's that piece as well, and putting it in the strategy documents. I used to be a real kind of cynic about strategy documents, but now I understand that actually there's all these kind of regulatory kind of connections between these documents. So the strategy plan actually informs the operational plan in the different areas, and the operational plan determines the KPIs, and the KPIs determine the metrics. And, we just had a half-day planning session exactly on this yesterday, and the number of people said, oh, we're going to have to change the metrics. We're measuring the wrong thing. It's like, yeah, but that's hard. Like, I'm not saying, we're just asking the question. So yes, very hard, and particularly the sort of work you're doing. It's so important, and it just, it's so important to create the right structures to support that.
Thanks, Lauren. So next I have Andrea.
Hi, thank you, Lauren, for your talk. It was very, very interesting. I've heard you talking more about the role of universities and the SDGs before, and I really like this approach to climate change adaptation. So my question is quite simple. Have you seen any examples of universities, maybe beyond Australia, that have incorporated climate change adaptation in the way that you were presenting it? And my question comes a little bit, with a small comment. So I am a PhD candidate. I am researching universities and the SDGs. And in one of my cases in Mexico, one university, I have seen an example of them incorporating climate change adaptation as part of their sustainability plan. But part of it, because one of the person that's leading that was also part of the IPCC, was working with the IPCC report. So he pushed very much for that. And at the same time, there was a vice presidency created for sustainability, inclusion, and social impact. So there's a big structure supporting all of this, the incorporation of climate change adaptation in their plans. So that's an example. And I also thought of a research project that is called Climate U, Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate. And I think they're looking at Mozambique, Brazil, Fiji, and probably another country I can't remember right now. And in their theoretical framework, they do include climate change adaptation, but I haven't read any of the cases talking. So yeah, more of an example, because mine are more plans, as in I've heard about a plan, a strategic plan that incorporated that, and then they're analyzing that, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrea. And yeah, so there are some really good examples around. I invite Todd to jump in because he's been doing some of this analysis, but off the top of my head, Rutgers University in New York is an amazing example of a really, really thorough, inclusive approach, huge amount of work going into bringing in community members, students, staff to really develop it together. And, you know, it's no coincidence that that's being led by two key climate change academics. And so, you know, I do think it sounds self-serving, but I do think if you actually allow academics with expertise in these areas to stand up and start to influence institution organizational processes and planning, bringing their expertise to bear, you get good results. And it sounds like that's similar to the one in Mexico as well. And I'd say that's also behind some of the great climate emergency declarations work we've seen as well, working alongside, of course, the students who are the real engine there. So there are some really, really good examples. There's also, I can see Darren's put in a network. There's also a good network, name slipped out of my mind for the moment, in the US. I know McGowan's work, the Climate U as well. So there are opportunities emerging, which I think is really positive. And part of it is about trying to kind of accelerate our own progress by cooperating. You know, universities are so damn kind of insular and kind of navel gazing. You know, we actually need to do this really well, or maybe we should set up adaptation as a competition. I'm not sure, but whatever we need to do, we need to work together so that we're learning and we're not all just kind of like reinventing the wheel, because we just don't have time for that. I also just want to pick up a comment Brian has made there in the chat about learning from the initiatives and that were being tried. And so there's two things there. One is, so Wendy Steele and I tried to reframe research impact in the RMIT context to include the impact on researchers and on the university. So kind of, you know, turning the impact arrow around a little bit. What have we learned? What do we do differently? But also in this adaptation space, in the climate change exchange that I'm involved in, that is all about trying to say, okay, we've learnt this. What are some of the key lessons? Let's apply them over here. Again, kind of, you can see I'm a little bit panicked by this, trying to accelerate action and progress in all the ways. Sorry, I realised the time.
Well, thanks very much, Lauren. I think you're right on time, actually. So I don't think we have time for any more questions, but look, thanks very much for a great presentation, very thought-provoking. It's a real pleasure to host you here, and thank you so much for giving up your time. Can I see a virtual round of applause for Lauren? So, thanks again, Lauren.
Pleasure. Yeah, really look forward to continuing the conversation, because this, you know, is highly pertinent. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. And thanks again for the opportunity. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Good luck, everyone.